When a parent reaches middle age, this is usually around the time that most of their children will start to leave the home. This is what we would call the empty nest. And this transition from having children in the house to having them, living independently will succeed largely if the parents focus on autonomy, training the child to be autonomous before they go. So teaching the child how to cook, teaching the child how to clean, and just take care of themselves in general. Those are very important skills children need to learn before they can truly be independent. Now, women who go through this experience and see motherhood as their primary role report much more negative mood during this time. It's kind of like they spent the vast majority of their life doing this one job of taking care of kids, and now they're suddenly fired. They're suddenly laid off. They don't know what to do, and it's a pretty upsetting experience, I'm sure you can imagine. But just in general, this transition, it does tend to resolve itself in time, and people do tend to adapt to these new conditions. And once their children have moved out and started to live independently for a period of time, they'll start to see their middle-aged parents in a more positive light. Like, they'll start to understand the struggles their parents faced over time. But not all children will stay gone once they leave. Roughly half of the young adults nowadays will move back in with their parents at least once. And the term we have for these individuals is boomerang kids. It's like you thought you were rid of them and they just come flying right back. Now, the kids who are most likely to do this, the kids who are most likely to be boomerang, are the ones that have financial concerns, which is pretty common nowadays. People are just having trouble finding good paying jobs, paying their rent, paying their tuition and bills. Another big factor we see for boomerang kids is whether or not they're male. Male children tend to not be as autonomous. They tend to not know how to take care of themselves as well, so they desire that comfort of home where there is others there that can help them. Another one is if the individual is struggling to be successful in their occupation, whether it's school or work. But yeah, like having a lower GPA, for example, that would be that's a factor. And then the last one would just be autonomy in general. So sure, men tend to have a lower autonomy, but whether you're a man or a woman, if you don't know how to take care of yourself properly, if you don't know how to cook and clean and so on, then you're going to most likely move back in with your parents eventually. But in our society, we generally see this as a pretty negative thing. It's kind of like the child has failed to adult or something like that. But in other countries, this is actually pretty normal. In a lot of other countries, in fact, in most countries, staying with your parents until you have a full-time, good-paying job or you get married is pretty common. It's just here in the US, we have this strong emphasis on being independent and such, so that a lot of parents feel like they have to push their kids out of the house once they reach adulthood. But when the kids do eventually leave and everybody's gone their separate ways, now this mother who's experiencing the empty nest, she's going to take on a new role. It's usually the middle-aged mother that takes on the role of the kinkeeper. This is the person who gathers the family together for celebrations and just to keep people in touch. And for a lot of middle-aged adults, they also have a whole new set of responsibilities. They're still taking care of their older children. A lot of these older children are still living at the home, as I mentioned. But they're also starting to need to take care of their older parents. They have these two different kinds of dependents that they're dealing with. And this is why we call a lot of middle-aged adults sandwich generation. They're the ones that are needing to be responsible for both kinds of dependence. And taking care of your older parents can be quite taxing on an individual. But most adults do it gladly. Most adult children feel an obligation, a filial obligation, this desire to want to care for their parents if their parents need help. And across cultures, typically it's the daughters that are most likely to provide this care, or daughters-in-law. They're in fact 3 times more likely than the sons to provide this kind of filial care. And in more extreme cases where parents become increasingly more dependent on their children, these aging parents may in fact move in with their now middle-aged children after spending a period of time where they're independently living. This is exactly the situation I saw with my grandparents. They moved in with my uncle for a period of time. Now, across culture, this filial obligation thing is usually something that does, bond children with their aging parents. And as I already mentioned, most of these middle-aged children, they are perfectly happy to accommodate their aging parents' needs. But it does come with some stressors. Obviously, it's going to be stressful if this older individual has a lot of health concerns and just needs in general. Caring for one's parents, in fact, does often get in the way. It coincides with most individuals' peak employment years. But when it comes to women in particular, this doesn't really matter. They don't really care about this so much. Taking care of the parents, satisfying this filial obligation is much more important. So it minimally affects their decision to provide care. But it can have a negative impact. If there's this kind of conflict between what their parents need them to do and what they need to do for their career, it can have a negative impact on their just ability to be effective in all regards. They'll probably experience some degree of burnout. They'll lose the relationship they had with their parents. They may in fact feel more intimate, and they may in fact feel pretty satisfied that they're giving back, but they don't really look to their aging parents, their now dependent parents, in the same way. They look at these aging parents more so as an obligation, not really as a friend, not really as a parent, but just like somebody you have to take care of now. So it can have a lot of negative effects on both their relationships and their career, and also their self. It can have a negative impact on their self-identity and just self-perception. But one other thing that a lot of people do experience when they reach middle age, moving into the later years, is becoming a grandparent. Grandparenthood, for a lot of individuals, is achieved in their 50s or early 60s. And being a grandparent is a big deal for most cultures around the world. Grandparents, cross-culturally, have played the role of enriching their grandchildren socially and personally through engaging children in the grandkids and recreational activities, passing on their family histories and culture, teaching various skills that they have acquired, and just giving advice in general. The grandparent is stereotypically the wise individual, the one who, passes on knowledge and skills to the kids. And grandkids also, provide an important role for grandparents. The relationship is mutually beneficial because these grandkids, they share the knowledge they've acquired because they're much more adaptive. They're picking up on new things, new advances in technology, for example, and they often will teach these skills, these newly acquired skills, to their grandparents. But like I said, it's a big deal. Being a grandparent is a very big deal. For some individuals, grandparenthood is in fact the most important thing in their lives. Up until the point where they become a grandparent, they may actually be becoming increasingly more despondent. But once that new child is born, it kind of reinvigorates their entire feeling of family. It's like a new chapter in their life. But there are some interesting ethnic differences we see when it comes to how an individual views being a grandparent. In a lot of European cultures, it's typically seen as a burden. These individuals who are late in their life, they just want to do their own thing. They want to go into retirement and enjoy life. And they don't want to have to deal with the, trouble that comes with young children. But in other kinds of cultures, like African and Latino and Asian cultures, individuals view this kind of, grandparental caretaking as important and rewarding. It's not just beneficial to the child, it also benefits themselves. And in many cultures, the grandparents are looked up to as models of, how to be an individual in that culture, how to be an individual of that particular ethnicity. They're seen as the child's primary source for learning about their heritage, and the grandparents do spend a lot of time passing on their beliefs and their values. You see this especially in the more traditional cultures. But times are changing, and what it means to be a grandparent has definitely changed with it. Nowadays, grandparents are living further and further away from their grandkids. This is largely due to just, economic issues, like parents have to travel quite a far way away to find a new job or whatever. So it kind of makes it hard to stay in touch and provide that role for your grandkids. But simultaneously, due to other kinds of economic factors, in a lot of cases, grandparents are actually raising the grandkids. So maybe the parents aren't capable of doing it, maybe the parents aren't even around anymore, but for whatever reason, the grandparents now are the primary caretakers. They serve as the custodial parents for their grandkids. So we see this quite often nowadays because, both parents in most families are having to work now, work full time just to get by. But that's just one reason why we might see this. When a grandparent does serve this role, however, while they might be able to do it quite effectively, they do face a lot of unfortunate obstacles, like legal issues. These grandparents often have trouble just, for example, obtaining school records or getting children enrolled in various things, getting children's insurance all squared away so that the kids can get proper medical care and such. So they just have a lot of additional difficulties due to the fact that they're not the biological parents. And in many cases, they're not even the legal parents. They're just the ones who are actually raising that child. And just to mention one final thing about all this, grandkids who are raised by their grandparents, they can benefit from that greatly. It can be a mutually beneficial relationship like I've been describing, but we do more commonly see certain problems in kids raised under these conditions. They tend to have more learning difficulties and more behavioral problems, like hyperactivity, for example. Now, I'm not saying that these things are caused by being raised by your grandparents. I'm just saying there does seem to be a correlation there. Exactly how that correlation works, it's hard to say.